Star Wars is one of the most popular and financially successful franchises of all time, with a seemingly endless amount of books, comics, movies, TV shows, video games, and of course, merchandise. But before Star Wars was a sprawling figurehead of pop culture, it was a single indie film which went well over budget during production and was considered by many to be destined for financial failure. But what would have happened to Star Wars if it hadn't been a record breaking hit and the money had run dry? What if we wiped the slate clean, not just of the sequels and the prequels, but of the expanded universe, and even Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi? Believe it or not, this isn't a pure hypothetical. George Lucas was well aware that his film had a chance to flop, and when he commissioned author Alan Dean Foster to ghostwrite the novelization for Star Wars, he also contracted him to write a sequel book that could later be adapted into a second, much lower budget film if Lucas's more expensive ideas didn't pan out. This book was called Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and looking back on it with the knowledge we have now of how the story ended up is nothing short of fascinating. The book opens with Luke and Leia traveling by ship to a planet that reportedly has shown interest in the rebel cause, but as our heroes travel through the system, Leia's engine spontaneously goes out and they crash land on a seemingly uninhabited swamp world. This sets the tone for the rest of the book. The rough draft of the book featured a dogfight in place of a spontaneous engine outage, but the scene was altered to keep a potential film's budget down, and the swamp world setting was chosen for similar reasons. But it's not just the scale that sets Splinter apart from Empire. There's a strange, undefinable, almost fever dream-like difference between the versions of the characters we ended up getting and the way that these characters are presented in Splinter. Han Solo and Chewbacca are nowhere to be found, since, of course, Harrison Ford would have driven up the price of a movie adaptation far too much. But even the characters that we do see just seem a little off. R2-D2 and C-3PO are present, for example, but I'll put it this way, I knew something was up when C-3PO stayed quiet so that Princess Leia could focus during the crash landing at the beginning of the book. They filled the role of generic robot servants far more than they feel like fully fledged characters, and now that I think about it, I'm not sure I can honestly tell you a single time that either droid took an action that definitively impacts the story in a meaningful way. Even when other characters have to communicate with aliens speaking a different language, which is C-3PO's primary purpose, he's just sort of awkwardly placed in the background of the scene, while Luke displays a mastery of an obscure language he has no business knowing. And speaking of Luke, both him and Leia are written quite differently than the versions we've gotten used to. Luke goes through quite a bit less of a character arc in this, staying much more static to his original appearance in A New Hope, and at the time the book was written, the movie that establishes their sibling relationship was still years in the future, so there's a pretty prevalent romantic subplot going on. But the lack of Skywalker backstory changes Leia's character in other ways as well. In canon Star Wars, Leia is displayed as a resourceful and brave leader with a kind heart and the best qualities from both of her parents, but without nearly as much material to go off of, Alan Dean Foster has written Leia the way that you'd kind of imagine a spoiled princess turned rebel being. Despite her attitude and spirit, she needs a lot of protection, and she shows a truly unusual ambivalence towards the suffering of others. There's even a scene where she explains that she really became a rebel because of her love for the aesthetic. She is definitely still a hero, but she comes across as spoiled and immature, without many of the qualities that go on to define Leia in the main Star Wars timelines. Her responses to trauma also set Splinter apart from the typical Star Wars stories. Star Wars is first and foremost a spectacle, a space opera where characters are larger than life and emotional reactions to events are either extremely muted or dramatically exaggerated depending on what the plot requires. Sometimes a character will get tortured or lose a limb and just cheerfully shake it off, ready to jump into the next part of their grand character arc without hesitation. But other times, a character will show you how upset they are by traumatic events by just keeling over and dying. Neither reaction would make much sense in the real world, but in the context of Star Wars, the over-representation of emotional extremes helps give it that fairy tale, almost mythological feeling. By comparison, Splinter of the Mind's Eye presents a soberingly realistic reaction to emotional turmoil. Leia spends much of the book unsuccessfully fighting off panic attacks as their situation worsens, and by the time Vader shows up, they unironically suggest just giving up and killing themselves not once, but twice. And by the way, despite being on the cover of the book, Vader doesn't actually show up until the last 50 or so pages, which is definitely a pity, since one of the main draws of this book is getting to read a different version of Vader before Empire Strikes Back identifies him as Anakin Skywalker. Even in the short time that you see Vader in this story, you can tell he's a very different character. He takes an almost Palpatine-like joy in the prospect of causing pain, laughing and taunting the heroes as he approaches victory, which lies in stark contrast to the Anakin version of Vader, who really just has an inability to take any joy in anything. Unfortunately, like I said, the story is over and Vader is dispatched before you can really see all that much of him. But how could the story be over when I haven't even described any sort of plot? Well, to be honest, that's because not a whole lot happens in this story. There are really two primary plot points: Luke and Leia's quest to get back off-world, and then their quest to find the Kyber crystal, an ancient relic that an old lady in the mining town tells them about that can apparently amplify any Force user's power exponentially. Both of these plot points are theoretically interesting, but they just sort of happened. Even when the plot is moving forward, it tends to feel like everyone is just wandering around a swamp, and when the book ends, you're left wondering why such a small story needed to be told at all. That's not to say there isn't anything to like about Splinter of the Mind's Eye. There's a cave sequence that features some really cool caverns, an underground lake, and some neat world building, as well as some entertaining fight scenes and some cool lore tidbits. But at the end of the day, Splinter of the Mind's Eye is a version of Star Wars written to be a safe, low-budget follow-up to a movie that people really expected to fail. It wasn't a story written about fresh ideas as much as it was worried about reusable assets and safe decision-making. And this isn't something that I hold against Alan Dean Foster either. I might not think the book is very good, but this is what he was paid to write. And I've read a number of his other books and enjoyed them quite a bit, especially the Ice Rigger trilogy. But at the end of the day, A New Hope left a lot of unanswered questions, and Splinter just cannot hide the fact that it was not written by the only person with those answers. Of course, thankfully, Star Wars didn't fail. The movie was a generational hit, and Splinter of the Mind's Eye was shelved in favor of Empire Strikes Back, a fully fledged sequel that spared no expense. But Splinter did go on to influence Star Wars in a couple of ways, with the design of the swamp planet being partially reused for Dagobah, the name of the planet Mimban being canonized, and the Rise of Kylo Ren comic sending the Knights of Ren to Mimban in search of the Mind Splinter, which is a fairly obvious reference to the first expanded universe project we're talking about right now. There's also the term Kyber crystal, which was reused for the crystals that power lightsabers, although with a different spelling. And though Splinter would not have more than a surface-level impact on the direction of the Star Wars story, it remains an interesting look at an alternative world and a reminder of just how much of Star Wars' lore is really thanks to the second and third movies of the original trilogy. Can I recommend it as a genuinely good book or a particularly well-crafted Star Wars story? Not necessarily, but I can tell you it's kind of interesting.